Hello and welcome back to Wyoming Watch. I'm IB Secrest, your crime and public safety reporter. On Monday, the 2026 budget session will begin, kicking off 21 days of intensive legislative work in Wyoming. This week, we'll be discussing what that session entails and what Wyomingites should keep an eye out for. We are here today with our state government reporter, Noah Zahn, who's phoned in to chat with us a bit about the upcoming legislative session. Welcome back, Noah.
Hi, Abby. Thank you.
So we've got a pretty short, quick and sweet budget session coming up here, and I just wanted to chat with you a bit about what we should be looking for as the session comes up and what we are kind of expecting coming out of this.
Like you said, it's a shorter session. I guess on odd number years, they have a general session, and on even number years, they have a budget session. Since it's 2026, they're having that budget session. So it'll be 20 days of working through that stuff. And the primary goal of this session is to, pass a budget for the state, which covers everything the state funds for the next 2 years. And they'll also, take some time to consider some other bills, which is stuff that, you and I have both been covering with some of our other reporters, And so they'll be talking about those things as well. But like I said, the primary purpose of this session is to pass that budget. And it's particularly interesting this year because, last year the legislature failed to pass a supplemental budget, which is not a necessary budget, but it's sort of just additional funds that the governor requests since, this budget session funds every 2 years, and that supplemental budget, is just kind of additional stuff for that year in between that maybe wasn't accounted for in the previous year. They didn't pass that last year, so it's going to be interesting to see how things go this year. There's been a lot of cuts already to the proposed budget, and I'm sure there will be more cuts and more amendments that'll happen over the next couple of weeks when this kicks off.
Yeah, absolutely. We do still, even though it is a budget session, we've got a couple of non-budget related bills on the table. Tell me a little bit about, for our listeners that don't know, that aren't state gov reporters and aren't very familiar with this process, how does a bill go through the legislature? What happens?
Yeah, so starting with the basics there, I think that'll kind of help understand and frame some of these other bills that we're going to talk about. But throughout the rest of the year that's not during a legislative session, these lawmakers work to craft bills, and they're written by the Legislative Service Office. And those bills are either sponsored by individual members of the legislature or committees, which are groups of lawmakers. And whenever the session kicks off, that bill is introduced either to the House or the Senate, depending on who the sponsor was typically. And it needs to get a 2/3 majority vote of whichever chamber it's going to just to be introduced, since it's a non-budget bill. And the presiding officer over that chamber will then send that bill to a standing committee, which are ongoing committees within a legislative body that typically handle issue-specific subject areas like agriculture, education, revenue committees, those things like that. Then during those committee hearings, that's kind of the first reading of it. And so the committee it's assigned to will hold a public hearing on it. They'll take testimony from anyone, usually lobbyists and experts. Anyone can go and talk to them pretty much. And the committee will typically not pass it or pass it with amendments. And that just takes a simple majority. After that 2/3 majority vote to introduce the bill, the rest of the way, they just need a simple majority to pass through whichever stage it's in. So after that committee hearing, it'll go to committee of the whole, which I think I said earlier that the committee hearing was kind of the first reading. I misspoke. The committee of the whole is actually kind of the first reading. And that's when a full chamber will discuss it, either the Senate or the House. And it's typically a little bit, more informal compared to the regular floor hearings. And again, as a full body, they'll just kind of talk about potential amendments or just discussing the merits of the bill. And if a bill fails at either of those two stages, then typically it'll be effectively dead for the rest of the session. If it passes that committee of the whole, it goes on to its second and third readings, staying within that chamber, whichever one it's in. And more of the same stuff happens there, just working through amendments, discussing the bill, what they want to do with it. So once it makes it through all three of those readings, it gets transferred to the other chamber, so either from the House to the Senate or vice versa. And then that whole sequence repeats, where it's introduced, assigned to a committee, then it goes through all those different readings. If it's approved by the opposite side, then it's going to go to the governor's desk. If there's differences, like if the Senate makes amendments to a bill that the House has approved, then, the chambers need to concur on that. So it'll go back to the House and they'll see if they can agree on that. If they don't agree on that, then there can be assigned to a conference committee to reconcile those differences. But after all that's happened, the bills that make it through that whole process will end up on the governor's desk, who will either sign it into law or veto it, or sometimes allow it to become law without his signature. And I guess the last thing for that is, to note is just that the legislature, if they want to, they can override a governor's veto, but they need a 2/3 vote in both chambers to do that. So that's kind of just the process of how those things will make it through this upcoming budget session.
Fantastic. And you did mention we have a few bills coming through that are non-budget related. You also mentioned that we have had a lot of cuts to the proposed budget already, and we probably should expect a few more amendments or cuts coming up as we go into the actual session. What areas specifically are seeing cuts, and what justification has been given so far for those cuts?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the primary goal of this session is to pass a budget. And in November, the governor, Mark Gordon, he released his proposed biennium budget, which was a little over $11 billion to cover things for the next 2 years. He called it the essentials, saying that it was fiscally conservative. And, during the interim, like you mentioned, there have been a decent amount of cuts to it that's been made by the Joint Appropriations Committee. And how that's worked is, each state department has gone before the Joint Appropriations Committee, presented their budget, explained why they've wanted what they have. And, typically they'll also ask for some additional funds. And sometimes those have been approved. Sometimes they've been denied. And, a handful of times this year, like you mentioned, they've cut some of those, just that basic initial request for budgets that have happened. And a lot of that has happened. The Joint Appropriations Committee is kind of led by some members of the Wyoming Freedom Caucus, which has a majority in the House, particularly Representative John Baer and Representative Ken Pendergraft. But I guess essentially to get to the point of your question, what you're actually asking, what has been cut, I think one of the biggest ones that has caught a lot of eyes for this upcoming session is cuts to the University of Wyoming, which is the state's only publicly funded four-year university. The Joint Appropriations Committee cut $40 million to the university, which is almost 11% of what the University of Wyoming receives from the state. And, an important thing to note for that is the committee exempted some of the schools at the university from those cuts. It exempted the College of Agriculture, Life Sciences, and Natural Resources, as well as the College of Education from those cuts. So some of those other schools could feel those cuts even more, up to 15% reduction, closer for them if those other schools are exempted. And there's also been some funding for some grant matching funds for the university. And outside of that, some other things have been the cuts for Wyoming Public Media, which would impact Wyoming PBS. There's been some concern about that. And another big one that has been controversial is the Joint Appropriations Committee also voted to completely remove from the governor's budget funding for the Wyoming Business Council, which, tries to help business developments, employment, things like that in the state. So the funding for that has been completely cut, which means that it would cease to exist. But all of those things are still, subject to change throughout the session. The budget isn't just a yes or no vote based off of what the Joint Appropriations Committee did to the governor's initial proposed budget. There will still be a lot of discussions and amendments to that. So we'll just kind of have to see how those play out over the next couple of weeks.
So they've got quite a lot of work ahead of them, making sure that this budget gets to a point where they can vote it through towards the end of the session. Alongside that work, they've also got these other bills that we were discussing. So tell me a little bit about what are some of the other non-budget bills that legislators will be working alongside the budget?
Yeah, there's, quite a bit. We definitely won't have time to get through all of them, but one of the big things over the past few years, for sure, has been property taxes in Wyoming. And those discussions have been going on for a few years. A lot of lawmakers have, identified that as a primary concern that their constituents have told them. A lot of, people who were elected, especially in the past few years, kind of ran on this platform of, if you vote for me, I'll save your money by helping cut property taxes. And so last year, this resulted in kind of a blanket 25% cut of residential property taxes residential properties valued up to $1 million. There were additional programs passed, like some property tax refund programs, exemptions for veterans, and exemptions for long-term homeowners in the state. And a lot of lawmakers, particularly in the Wyoming Freedom Caucus, have been saying that those cuts still are not enough, though. And they're, in meetings that I've been at, some of them have called property taxes just as a concept unconstitutional. And so this has resulted in several new proposals as well. There's been, over the next few weeks, in addition to those cuts I just talked about, there's bills that would expand or extend some of those existing cuts. There's some bills to change the way that property value is assessed. So right now it's assessed on the fair market property value, and there's a bill to change it to acquisition value, which would be, your property is taxed based off of how much it cost when you purchased it. And then that tax could increase by a set rate every year to account for inflation or things like that. That's a system they have in California right now. But the big one that we'll be following is one that tries to completely eliminate property taxes in the state. And Wyoming already doesn't have an income tax. So there's been some concern about that. We'll get to that in a second. But one of the proposed solutions, if that is the route that lawmakers decide to take, is to increase sales tax from 4% to 6%. And to do this, lawmakers would have to make an amendment to the state constitution, which would mean putting that to a vote of the people of Wyoming. So if that passes, we could see a vote on that coming in the election later this year in 2026. And like I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of pushback on that. Municipalities and counties talk about how this would harm their ability to fund essential services, because a lot of funding for those towns and counties come from property taxes. Could affect things like, law enforcement, fire safety. I know you've covered a decent amount of that too, Ivy. And I've also spoken with some lawyers and tax experts who say that this may not be the best approach to do it, maybe from a more moral perspective. Some of them have seemed to have, because they say that sales taxes are more regressive, which means that it disproportionately impacts the lowest income families in the state. And, there's members of the Freedom Caucus who have acknowledged this concern. But like I said earlier, they see it as a constitutional dilemma. They think it's more fair or more just maybe for people to be taxed based off of their purchasing decisions, like a sales tax, rather than being taxed for just owning property. So again, on that one, we'll just have to see how those things go.
What do we have going on in the Rural Health Transformation Program?
So the Rural Health Transformation Program is a new program. It came out of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and it distributes federal funds across the states, more focused on rural health. And a lot of those funds make up for lost funds that same act cut. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But initially, this Rural Health Transformation Program was accounted for in the governor's proposed budget. Lawmakers voted to remove it from the budget. And that doesn't mean that Wyoming doesn't want those funds. It just means that they'll be discussing that individually rather than as a piece of the budget. And I think that way it might be more likely to pass, or at least pass quicker. And so we'll see how that goes. This first year for it, the first year for it, Wyoming will get $205 million from it. And it plays out over 5 years. So Wyoming could get more than $1 billion from this program over the next 5 years if they continue to receive those same amount of funds. Some of those funds under the Department of Health's current plan to allocate those would include access to healthcare in rural areas, particularly for maternity care, which has been a concern in a lot of areas across the state. And it also looks to create some incentive programs that would educate and maintain healthcare workers in Wyoming. And a very large portion of those funds would also be put into a perpetuity fund, which means that the state could save some of that money and just kind of hold on to it to continue to fund some of these new programs it's creating, so that it doesn't just kind of fizzle out once those funds die off, after the 5-year program ends. So that's kind of what's going on for the rural health program.
Mm. And then So, what has been, since that came out of the big, beautiful bill, what has been the discussion so far around that program? Has there been a lot of support for taking on those dollars? What has been the general attitude of legislators?
It's interesting in Wyoming, a lot of these lawmakers don't want to rely on federal support to, stay afloat and have these kinds of programs. But my sense generally is a lot of these lawmakers are saying the federal government wants to give us $205 million this year. Why not take it? If it's on the table, the state won't have to pay anything for it. I have also spoken to some people who think that lawmakers, the Joint Appropriations Committee, pulling that rural health transformation program out of the governor's budget and running it as its own bill is a little bit of a sign of concern that, a lack of confidence in the legislature's ability to pass a budget while still wanting to have that as a separate bill to at least be able to secure those funds. So my sense is that one should get through pretty comfortably, but it's going through the legislature as a bill that cannot be amended, really. So it's either we take this program as it was given to us and drafted by the Department of Health and amended by the Joint Appropriations Committee. So either they accept that or they deny it as a whole. And actually, we're recording this on February 4th. Tomorrow, Thursday, the Joint Appropriations Committee is meeting one last time before the session. So they're going to talk about this bill and finalize the last few things up before it goes to the legislature next Monday. So, there's a few things I'm saying that could be different by then, but that's what I know right now.
Fantastic. And then let's talk a little bit about election reform, because was a hot topic last session. It looks like it's going to be a hot topic again this session. What are we looking at as far as election reform bills?
Yeah, it really was a hot topic last session. There were around 45 bills proposed last year in the 2025 general session, kind of concerning election reform in some regard. And only a few of those actually made it to the governor's desk. And a lot of those were kind of spearheaded by the Secretary of State, Chuck Gray. And like I mentioned, a lot of those some of those made it to the governor's desk. A couple of them were signed into law. A handful of them failed as well. And so Gray is now trying to get a lot of those back to be considered again in this upcoming session. And I went to a press conference that he held in December where he talked about, a lot of those hopes for this upcoming session concerning those bills that failed last year. During that press conference, he really criticized the Senate a lot because a lot of these bills were passed in the House, which had that Freedom Caucus majority, and typically the Freedom Caucus has, historically supported these election reform bills that Gray has put forward. The Senate, the Freedom Caucus doesn't technically exist in the Senate. It's just a House caucus. So that it typically died there. So he was pretty critical of the Senate at that press conference. So I'll walk through some of those bills that he talked about at that conference, at least. One of them is requiring pen to paper ballots as the default method of, collecting votes. Currently, I think that Laramie County is the only place in the state that would be really impacted by this because it uses machines to take ballots and count them. And, most other places have that, ballot that you, with a pen or pencil, I guess a pen, fill in that circle and cast your vote that way. But these ones, once you vote, it's like a touchscreen machine and it prints out this, I guess, sort of a receipt of your ballot, and it has a barcode on it, so you can't really see what's on there. And then a machine reads that barcode to count your vote. And so this upsets the Secretary of State because, he talks about how people can't really read barcodes, so there's not enough transparency of knowing exactly who your vote is being cast for if you don't have that pen to paper thing going on. So that's one of those bills. Another one is banning drop boxes and ballot collection. Again, similar transparency concerns about knowing exactly what happens or not being able to see your ballot once it goes into a drop box. And ballot collection is the process of, gathering and submitting those completed absentee or mail-in voter ballots by someone else doing that, gathering those. And it's usually helpful for people with limited access to voting locations, but again, that's another transparency concern he has. I'll just do a few more of these that he has here. One is having a true photo ID for the voter IDs. So that would be making it that every valid voter identification card has a valid photo of the person on that ID, and that would invalidate things like Medicare or Medicaid cards used for voting. And, there's concerns for a lot of older folks, maybe, who have those as their primary identification cards for voting. Another one that he's putting forward is requiring hand tabulation for recounts and audits. All of these bills so far are ones that, failed last year that he put forward, and he's, trying to revive, see how they do again this year, I guess. And so this proposal would implement mandatory hand recounts in races that are decided by a narrow margin, or allow candidates to request hand recounts. And I think the last one I'll talk about is a new one this year that he's putting forward, which would be banning dual citizenship voting. I haven't found out much about how much of an issue this currently is in the state, but this is just one that he has a concern. I remember he was saying that people shouldn't be able to vote in Wyoming if they're, American citizens and citizens of another country at the same time. And so, I guess some criticisms on the other side of a lot of these bills. I've spoken with several county clerks across the state who have expressed budgetary concerns with all of these new regulations or new rules, especially with some of the ones passed last year too. And that kind of compounded with the continued and potentially further cuts to property taxes. Those county clerks get a lot of their funds from property taxes. So just being able to enforce those new rules for the upcoming session is a concern. So that's kind of a preview on some of the election reform stuff.
If I am recalling correctly, one of the other concerns is accessibility of voting, particularly with the machines. Can you talk a little bit about why we might have machines in some counties, or what the justification is for the machines?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, as far as I know, Laramie County is the only one that uses those machines for the actual taking someone's ballot on that election day. But other places you will use a machine to read those pen to paper ballots, so it's usually not hand counted. There have been calls for trying to hand count every single vote for every single election, and that might touch more on that accessibility concern that you're asking about, of just places not having the capacity to do that, and then also concerns about the accuracy of some of those hand counting. There's some general distrust in the machines, and a lot of these election voting software companies maintain that the machines are solid and accurate. The county clerks maintain that position as well.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you think the people of Cheyenne or our listeners in the broader state of Wyoming should be aware of as we prep for this session?
I mean, just it's best to stay educated on this stuff. If you want to go, if you're in Cheyenne, anyone can go testify on a lot of these bills that are being discussed. You should be able to sign up to do it virtually as well. I guess just stay tuned for more.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Noah, for coming back on. We really appreciate hearing from you.
Thanks, Ivy. Appreciate it.
Now, here's Taylor Staples, our arts and entertainment reporter, here to give us a roundup of some of the upcoming events in the area this week.
This list doesn't include the list of ongoing events or exhibits in the area, only day-to-day specific events. Today, January 6th, the Cheyenne Botanic Gardens has a Spring Pastels event from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Then, the library has a Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra lunch and learn at noon, and Terry Bison Ranch has a Mother-Son Valentine's Sweetheart Dance from 5 to 8:30 p.m. Also, the Lincoln has a DJ-led show at 7:30 p.m. called We Made You a Mixtape. On Saturday, February 7th, the day starts with a Habitat Hero workshop from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. at the Laramie County Community College Clay Pathfinder building, as well as a winter farmers market at the Cheyenne Depot from 9 a.m. to 1, and an Olympic-themed family day at the Wyoming State Museum from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Then, there's a Heart Windows and Tangle Box workshop at the Botanic Gardens from 10:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. Later, the Botanic Gardens has a mozzarella workshop at 5:30 p.m. and Frozen Fury on the Plains takes place at the Event Center at Archer at 6 p.m. And finally, the CSO has their America the Beautiful concert at 7 p.m. at the Cheyenne Civic Center. On Sunday, February 8th, there's a board game day at Game Masters from noon to 6 p.m. where people can play for free all day from the selection either they have or they can bring their own games. On Monday, February 9th, the Cowgirls of the West have their monthly luncheon at Little America at 11:30 a.m. Then LCCC's Sir Brugg Prentice Auditorium is hosting a stage concert at 7 p.m. On Tuesday, February 10th, there's a Cheyenne Women's Connection meeting from 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. at the Red Lion Inn, an Introduction to Zentangle workshop at the library from 2 to 4 p.m., a Valentine's Day craft extravaganza from 5 to 6 p.m., a Braver Angels of Laramie County discussion about the military and law enforcement from 6 to 7:30 p.m., and a Cheyenne Genealogical and Historical Society meeting from 6 to 8 p.m. Those last three events are also at the library. On Wednesday, February 11th, the library has L2B business drop-in session times from 9 to 11 a.m., as well as Library for All events from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m., and a Stitch Fix event from 5 to 7 p.m. Also, AARP has a community group meeting at the Laramie County Senior Center from 12:30 to 2 p.m., and Laura Phelps Rogers is holding a reception and artist talk at LCCC's Esther and John Clay Fine Art Museum from 2 to 4 p.m. Finally, on Thursday, February 12th, there's a teen writing club at the library from 4 to 5 p.m., a living room conversation session about self-compassion from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., also at the library, and there's a Wyoming State Archives speaker series session on Estelle Reel from 7 to 8 p.m. That talk can be attended both in person at the Wyoming State Museum or via Zoom. For a full list of events, go to wyomingnews.com/calendar.
In the headlines this week. Currently, Wyoming is one of only 3 states without a fund dedicated to addressing housing concerns through local solutions. A bipartisan group of Wyoming legislators are seeking to create a $30 million revolving loan fund to change that. Senate File 64 seeks to establish the Wyoming Housing Revolving Loan Program to provide funding for planning, construction, and rehabilitation of homes across the state. And following a move to delay the decision regarding administrative inspection warrants at the Cheyenne City Council meeting January 9th, members of the Council's Public Services Committee began proposing amendments to the ordinance at a meeting Monday. The warrants are non-criminal warrants that allow city officials to enter a property for safety or code enforcement inspections when they are unable to get the property owner's permission. Over the past several weeks, countless members of the public have attended council meetings to speak against the ordinance, with many saying it violates their Fourth Amendment rights. And, following a screening of a PBS Independent Lens documentary titled The Librarians, hosted Saturday at the Laramie County Community College, panelists discussed the local impact of nationwide efforts to restrict access to books in local libraries. Among the panelists was former Executive Director of Campbell County Public Library, Terry Leslie, who was dismissed from her position in Gillette in 2023 after refusing to remove books with sexual content and LGBTQ+ themes from a library's children and young adult sections. In April of 2025, she filed a federal lawsuit claiming the county had defamed her and violated her civil rights, which resulted in a $700,000 settlement. That's all for this week's episode of Wyoming Watch. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to listen next week for more local news.